Bonjour, good morning, and good afternoon to our American, British, and Canadian colleagues. Je suis Alexandra Bugailiskis et j'aurai le plaisir de présider l'édition 2026 du Dialogue Transatlantique. A special note of thanks to our host this year, AM Canada, and President Michael Small, to Edward Glover, Chair of the FCDOA, and Tom Reckford, who's been coordinator at Dakar. I can't think of a more necessary time to reach out to diplomatic colleagues like you to renew and strengthen those ties that bind us, a commitment to serve our countries, and a belief that the practice of diplomacy can build a more prosperous, safer, and sustainable world for all. Many of the precepts with which we started and pursued our careers are being challenged today. And so we'll be asking our esteemed panelists to share their assessments of the current state of international affairs and whether we are witnessing a temporary or a fundamental shift. Most importantly, they'll offer some advice to the current generation of diplomats on the practice of diplomacy in a dystopian world. Before I introduce our three panelists, some very short administrative notes. Today's discussion will not be under Chatham House rules. The panelists have agreed to the recording so that we can share our insights with our working colleagues. And following a discussion of approximately 45 to 50 minutes, we will turn to questions from our audience. With over 350 registered participants, we're going to ask you to demonstrate your skills in brevity and to write your questions into the Q&A function. They'll be read out by my colleague, Olivier Nikolov, who's been instrumental in organizing today's event. Vous pouvez soumettre vos questions en anglais et en français. And now, allow me the pleasure of introducing our panelists. Their impressive biographies have already been shared with you, so despite their long and storied experience, I'll keep it short. Dame Menna has blazoned new pathways as the first female in 2 centuries to serve as British ambassador to France and currently is the first female president of Queen's College, Cambridge. However, I share her aspiration that one day soon, such firsts will no longer be noteworthy. The Honourable Bob Rae, or Bob as he prefers, has just finished his tenure as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. He's a former politician who has found the light and demonstrated his commitment to the public good, serving in both provincial and federal legislatures, including as Premier of Canada's largest province. And Ambassador Ronald E. Neumann, he's currently president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. He served as ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan, and has authored 2 books and numerous articles on U.S. foreign policy and conflict management. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I will have the pleasure of posing a series of 3 questions to our esteemed panelists. The first question: do you agree with the underlying premise of the discussion today that we are entering a dystopian era? And drawing on your experience as a diplomat, what do you see as the 3 major changes in the international context which are impacting on the practice of diplomacy as you knew it? The order of response for this question will be Bob, Dave Menna, and Ambassador Neumann. Bob.
Well, thank you so much, and it's great to be able to join this call. As I think most, certainly of my Canadian colleagues, would say, well, Bob Rae's not really a diplomat, so we can ignore what he has to say. I do think we're in a profoundly difficult time. Orwell's description of the world that we're in 1984 and in Animal Farm is not very far removed from the world that we're living in at the moment. Whether or not it's permanent, I mean, I don't think anything is really permanent. I think all these trends come and go. But there are 3 underlying things that I think are profound. The first one is we are seeing a tectonic shift in the geopolitical plates that I think we've all seen it. I certainly saw it firsthand at the UN. And I think it's a challenge for us that we have to recognize you're not quite sure what team you're on. We're not quite sure who can be relied upon, which countries are on which side, on which set of issues. I think that's having a profound impact on the work that we do and our ability to do it well. The second underlying problem, I think, is the lack of trust in society generally, that I think is expressed very much in a sense of confidence in institutions, and a sense that the new politics is defined by a kind of populism that makes trust extremely difficult. And the third is just the reality of communication today, that the work of social media, the direct communication between ministers, the direct conversations between first ministers, makes the notion of steady, permanent structures which guide the functioning of an ongoing working diplomacy extremely difficult. And I think all of our ministries are having challenges figuring out how to become more nimble, more responsive to the pace of change, both technological and otherwise. So I would say those are three things that I've noticed and worked with, and I do think have a major impact on how diplomacy can work. I've also seen, one last point I would make is that some things still continue to be true, and that is that the value of private communication between two individuals who can trust each other and be assured to keep in confidence what is said is an absolutely essential part of human interaction and an essential part of our work as diplomats. And I've seen that function well in New York as a multilateral place where countries that often don't particularly get on well at a bilateral basis, where by establishing personal relationships, you can build knowledge and understanding that helps you to make some specific progress on difficult files that I think is an ongoing work of diplomats. Although haven't historically been a diplomat, I grew up in a diplomatic household. My father was in the Canadian Foreign Service for 40 years. So I have seen some things continue to be important, and there's not a complete loss of agency or effectiveness on the part of individual diplomats to do their job, provided they do it with integrity and with a sense of professionalism that I think is exceptionally important.
Thank you very much, Bob. I mean, the dynamics between multilateral and bilateral is a really important distinction, but I'm very happy to hear that element of trust, which is such a basis, for diplomacy, it still remains important. Well, with that, then thank you very much. We'll move to Dame Menna.
Thanks, Alex, and good afternoon from where I am, everybody. Just to say, I can see my camera keeps freezing, certainly at my end. So hopefully you can hear me and that my voice.
I can hear you perfectly, Dame Menna, and yes, and
okay, great.
Everything still look great.
Okay, it keeps freezing and then catching up very rapidly, so which is a bit disconcerting, but I shall keep calm and carry on, as we say. So the disadvantage of going after Bob is, of course, that I agree with everything that he's just said, and touches on a lot of what I think as well about, profound shifts in the geostrategic tectonic plates within which we operate, the lack of trust and speed. I did want to challenge a little bit the notion that we are in a dystopian world, because I think that's an expression we need to use with a certain amount of care. I saw one definition of it which does resonate, which is that it's the slow, silent normalization of what once would have shocked us. And I think there's definitely an element of that. I think things are happening that probably would have been inconceivable just a few years ago in different ways. But at the same time, I don't think we can say we are yet, hopefully never, in a world where institutions fail, freedoms collapse, violence becomes systemic, and human agency disappears. So I'm a bit more optimistic than that. But of course, exactly as Bob has said, we are in an incredibly turbulent, unpredictable, and dangerous period in history, probably to the greatest extent since the Second World War, and there's lots of data to support that. So last year, more than 60 state-based armed conflicts were recorded across 30 countries, and that's the highest number in 7 decades, which is sobering. I think this sense of, well, as democracy, backsliding is something we're all familiar with, looking at things like the Global Democracy Index, and global freedom has declined, according to some indices, for the 19th consecutive year. So yes, there are difficulties, but I don't think it's hopeless. And I think to be a diplomat, you have to actually be a pretty profound optimist, because you believe that you have agency, exactly as Bob has said, and through your actions you can continue to make a better world. But I also think that we need to take a longer view sometimes of history. And it was Richard Stafford Cripps, a British Labour politician and diplomat in the 1950s, who said, "We must not allow ourselves to be blinded to long-term developments by the intensity of short-term difficulties." And I quite like that, because when I think about my mum and dad are still alive, they're in their mid to late 80s. When they were born, we were in the middle of the Second World War and all the horrors that brought. 100 years ago in Europe, we were grappling with the end of the First World War, the Spanish flu, and sort of international institutions at that time were weak or non-existent. And you could argue that today's international system, though under strain, is much more robust, more interconnected, and more capable of coordinated action than back in the day. Taking all that into account, what three big changes do I think we see on the practice of diplomacy internationally? And very much building on what Bob's already said, I had mine under three S's: speed, spillover, and suspicion. Definitely some familiar trends here. So speed, absolutely, the world is moving faster than diplomacy can absorb. And I was reading a quote from somebody called Daniel Varre, who wrote, "In the early 20th century, a diplomat's life is made up of three elements: protocol, alcohol, and no news from home." And I thought, well, the first two of those still have an element of truth, right? Protocol and alcohol, even if we do always have zero alcohol options, obviously, at every British reception these days. But certainly the idea of no news from home rings really true. All news, not just bad news, travels fast. And, when I joined the Foreign Office back in 1989, we were still writing diplomatic cables on blue paper, and secretaries in the pool were typing them up. I mean, those days have long gone, and information spreads so quickly, often faster than we can verify it. And that, I think, puts huge pressure on diplomats, making decisions with less certainty, less time, and under a lot of public scrutiny. Second S was spillover, which is crises effectively no longer queue up politely one after the other. They all collide. They're no longer discrete events. They're interconnected with pressures that destabilize regions and stretch diplomats sometimes, and diplomatic bandwidth to breaking point. And I was thinking about the Horn of Africa as a good example of this, where recurrent droughts, extreme flooding have stripped communities of water, grazing land, and fertile soil, intensifying competition for resources and fueling armed conflict across Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, and Sudan. And what that does is lead to mass displacement. So nearly 3 million people uprooted by flooding in Somalia, over 10 million displaced in Sudan. And then that feeds into the migration crisis that we're seeing across Europe and other parts of the world. So UK immigration figures were out today, make interesting reading. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given what I've said, Eritreans are the most common nationality to arrive in the UK by small boat, followed by Afghanistan, Iran, Sudan, and Somalia. So what happens over there has a huge impact over here. That sort of spillover and interconnectedness, I think, is very much a feature of our modern world. And then thirdly, and briefly, because Bob's already covered it, suspicion. In other words, the opposite of trust, which is, I totally agree, an essential currency in the diplomatic world, but it's eroding, not just between states, but between governments and our own citizens. And according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, 69% of people globally now think that government officials, business leaders, journalists deliberately mislead them. And that's a record high and up an amazing 11 points just since 2021. And that brings popularization, populism, as people look for new solutions, different solutions, more radical solutions, narrowing the space for diplomatic compromise and dialogue. So in short, diplomacy becomes much harder because it depends on good faith, predictability, and legitimacy, all of which are in short supply. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Menna. I love the three S's. I think the distinction between personal trust in an individual, and you're absolutely right, trust in institutions and in government. But I am taken by your comments about your parents, because, of course, the rules-based order that we came to know was because of the chaos of World War II. And now, best for last, Ambassador Neumann.
I would not dream of saying the best is last, but anyway, I'm last. So thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Alex. Thank you for organizing us all. And strikes me one of the things that is huge change. I remember a few years ago, some of you may remember a book Thomas Friedman wrote called the Lexus Tree and the Olive, the olive tree, the Lexus, and he was talking about popular pushback against the speed of change and the breakdown of traditional societies. And when I read it, I think I and many others thought that this was a very good description of sort of the developing world, of the global South, where things were breaking down and people were pushing back. And now I think we're finding that it is, in fact, a much larger trend in the world at large, and that there is a deeper resistance to people's norms and traditions, whether they are looked at as traditions or habits. This is very irritating to people when it goes on year after year, faster and faster, feeling that other people are pushing things down their throat, and you get reactions, and that is sweeping through the world very unevenly, but I think is an underlying part of the movement of populist parties and is reflected in our work and in relations and in the breakdown of institutions, which my colleagues have mentioned and which I certainly subscribe to. Whether it is dystopian, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly, we're going through a very difficult period, but what one is going through always looks worse than anything you're reading about in the calmness of your armchair looking at history. So I wouldn't quite subscribe to the label, but the fact is that we are confronted with a disjuncture between the ability of states to deal with problems, hence the need for larger organizations and multinational approaches, multilateral approaches, and the fact that power has never actually moved out of the hands of states. For all of the organizations from the UN on through all the various other organizations, they are essentially convening organizations with the ability to bring people together and to make decisions, but the vast majority of action and certainly force still resides within states. So as you break away from the convening organizations, but you still are left with all the problems that are too large for states, transnational crime, drugs, so on, climate change. You have this disjuncture, this misfit between the tools that we're falling back on, particularly of bilateral diplomacy of the United States, and the problems which cannot be resolved on a bilateral basis. And that, to me, is a huge change. I would add another change. Well, there is a particular change in the role of the United States, and that is impacting everybody else, because the place of the United States now has become more uncertain. We have a national security strategy, which is a statement of objectives that ignores a large part of the world and which is not a strategy, since it doesn't tell you how you're going to get to any of them. But we have flipped back and forth, and we're becoming incoherent. And one of the key things about international relations generally is that you make assumptions about other key players in designing your own policies. And when those assumptions are not reliable, or when you're not sure what they are, then you tend to worst case everything. And that can also lead you to bad guesses in either direction. Going all the way to war, if you think an opponent will not react, you may be tempted to do things. If you get it wrong and they react, you have a war. So clarity is really useful. And when you have a situation as we have now, 2 days ago with the U.S. position on Diego Garcia, where one day the State Department expresses our strong support for the decision of the British government, and the next day the White House says we're absolutely opposed to this, you are left to wonder exactly which direction we're proceeding. And so that kind of confusion impacts everybody else, and it means everybody is slow to deal with things and deals with them on a worst case basis, and yet has to deal with the fact that we are too large in the United States to ignore. and you can't get along without us, and you sometimes can't get along with us. So let me leave it there so I don't exceed my time.
You haven't at all, Ambassador Neumann, and thank you very, very much. In that distinguishing issue about bilateral diplomacy and the uncertainty, I guess, is what you're saying, and even in this world that's going so rapidly, now we're actually slower, as you're saying, because we can't read, the room as we once could. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to move you to the second question. We'd like to hear your views on the possibility of adapting the more classic diplomatic skills to this new international environment. You've already touched upon it, many of you. For example, is the ability to find common ground and achieve positive sum outcomes still valued? And in a world of information and disinformation overload, how can a diplomat provide added value? Bob, you too also talked about how do you influence. The order of response this time will be Dame Menna, Ambassador Neumann, and then Bob. Thank you. Dame Menna.
Brilliant, thank you. And I've changed my camera. I've gone back onto my laptop so that I'm not doing that weird freeze frame thing. Yeah, I mean, just to pick up something that Ron just said then, actually, I was quite fond of saying this when I was in France, but what you just said makes me think it also goes for the United States and the rest of the world, which is, it's like the Richard Burton and Liz Taylor of international politics. We can't live with you, we can't live without you. They can't live together, they can't live apart, people used to say. And I think that absolutely resonates with me, and that sort of unpredictability baked into the operating environment, I think, because of decisions being taken in the United States, is something we're very conscious of. But to answer your question, Alex, which I think for me was very much about diplomatic practice, actually. And when I think of like classic diplomats, having spent 4 years in France, I tend to think of the great Talleyrand, one of the best diplomats that ever was. Well, according to the French, at least, and I'm sure it has some merit because he had remarkable longevity and was around throughout an incredibly turbulent period of French history around the revolutions and the Napoleonic era and beyond. And I've been reading about him. I've got a book to recommend, actually, which is this one by Robert Cooper, amazing book called The Ambassadors, which uses some great case studies, and there's some lovely descriptions of Talleyrand's diplomacy in this book. And Robert says he was the epitome of what's known as the classic canon of diplomacy, with diplomats as masters, always masters, of course, in those days, of timing, persuasion, discretion, and balance. He was famous for acting at the right moment and using strategic flexibility to get what he wanted. And he had a remarkable ability to foresee political shifts and position France and himself, one might say, accordingly through those revolutions, empires, and restorations. So I was thinking about what would a sort of updated canon of diplomacy look like? And it builds very much on what we've been talking about already. I think the first one is, more than ever in the context that we're in, staying calm under real-time pressure. And, I think Talleyrand made a virtue of waiting for the right moment for things to happen, but often today crises move too fast. But I still really think that diplomacy has to create the space to think, to provide steadiness, to hold that long-term view when everyone else is losing their heads. And I'd say that's a more necessary skill, than ever. I was thinking of a hymn, actually, which is, "Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways." And it's got this lovely line in it about speaking through the earthquake, wind and fire, "Oh, still small voice of calm, oh, still small voice of calm." And I think that is the role of diplomats, is to keep speaking, but in a very sort of calm way through the earthquakes, wind and fire that we're currently seeing in different parts of the world. I think the second sort of big thing, and the sort of thing that really struck me during my career, and the big change, I think the biggest change of all, is around technology. And what that means, I think, apart from speed, is that persuasion now happens in different arenas. The private room, I think, as Bob was saying, still absolutely space for those private conversations between ambassadors and ministers, between heads of state and government, even if they sometimes take place on WhatsApp these days rather than in person. And of course, everything can be public, as we've seen recently, but it's still a private space. But the public one is the really new one. And obviously, people like Talleyrand work behind the scenes, but today, public sentiment really shapes diplomatic space. And I think diplomats need to navigate the public and the private with great credibility and nimbleness, to use the word. And we see this above all on social media. And, I'm a bit of a joiner inner. I don't think there's a choice, really. I feel a bit similarly, I suppose, when it comes to artificial intelligence. But I do think that the best modern diplomats can use social media tools to great effect, to build connections and relationships, to develop virtual networks, and to promote their own country and a sense of a sort of love and respect for the country that they're in. And in the UK, we've got this brilliant diplomat, Japanese ambassador to the UK, Hiroshi Suzuki, who has just done amazingly on every social media platform. And he's done it by really sort of embedding himself in the country that he's posted to. So learning the Welsh national anthem, visibly loving Paddington. And it sounds so facile, but it's amazing how it works. That sort of authenticity that he brings to that. And that's opened doors for him. I mean, he's had interviews in mainstream newspapers. He's quite celebrated, I would say, on the London circuit. And that shows that, if you can use those tools successfully, it can still give you an in as a diplomat. But I also believe that, if you're not in the room, you can't influence things. And social media, unfortunately, can be a bit of a cesspit. And a lot of things are said on there which are very difficult. So I also think that today's diplomats, we need to train people to enter this world and to support resilience and well-being. As ambassador to France, I did suffer from trolling, which is horrible, not something that Talleyrand had to deal with, I'm sure, certainly not to his face. And I think that's hard for today's era of diplomats, and we need to support them. And then thirdly, just the expansion, I think, of what is the diplomatic world. And I'm conscious I'm really talking about bilateral diplomacy mainly here. So for Talleyrand, it was enough to read courts and to read leaders brilliantly. We absolutely still need to do that. And certainly, in France, what was happening in the Élysée Palace, who was up, who was down, who was in, who was out, what did the president think about different issues, was absolutely a core part of my job, but it wasn't enough. You've also got to read, digital ecosystems, what's going on in the business world, the economy, what's happening on climate change issues, technological disruption, and also threats to British citizens, in our case, abroad, a really important part of the job. So it's a much more complex and richer sort of landscape. So I think that means that diplomats have to get out more. We can't hide in capitals. We can't stay within the peripherique or within the beltway. If you're in Washington, D.C., you've really got to go out and, as one of my ambassadors said to me, get dust on shoes and really get out and understand the different parts of what is a country and where is power and what is formulating decision making on different issues. And that's quite tiring, I would say, as a diplomat. And I think it presents an interesting challenge for national leaders as well. If you think about our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, in his first year, he was out all the time because, in my view, he had to be. We don't really have a choice given the complex interconnectedness that we've discussed of how things over there impact what's happening at home. But he still got called, I think, Never Hear Keir was one tag associated with him because of this sort of this relentless need, in fact, to engage internationally. And then very quickly, also as part of that, I think, and that complexity, established norms, multilateral institutions are starting to break down in different ways, even if they're still relevant. And that fluidity and flexibility is extraordinary. So during my time in Paris, it was just after we'd left the European Union. We saw the emergence of the European political community, came out of nowhere. It was a Macron brainchild. And then suddenly it exists, and 51 states are all coming together for the first time. And I think that's sort of, that need to be agile, that agile minilateralism. If you think about the E3 in Europe, this sort of new group, really, UK, France and Germany, it's always been there, but sort of leaning on that in diplomatic terms more than ever before, more frankly, I think in some cases than the big, longer standing formal multilateral institutions. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Menna. Very, very full response. And now we'll move to Ambassador Neumann, please. We'll go from Europe over to North America.
Alex, thank you very much. This is a really fascinating discussion, and obviously I could go a long way in any of these things. I'm intrigued in a way by a sort of basic part of your question, which is a question that I feel like I've been dealing with, or we've all been dealing with for the better part of our careers. Do you need us? Does social media take our place? Can't everybody trust? And the profound ignorance that underlies those questions seems almost irreducible. That people don't understand the fundamental business that Bob Rae raised of trust. And in many cultures, you certainly do not have trust just because you pick up a phone and talk to somebody. In fact, you may not have trust if there's a third person in the room. And building the relationships is so key to diplomacy. There's, of course, the fact that for many countries, they're not adequately covered in the media anyway. That's particularly true, I think. I don't know if it's more true for the United States, but I remember when I was in Algeria, there were no American no American journalists there regularly. When they parachuted in for a crisis, they often didn't even speak French. They were dependent on us for help, or they spoke to a few sources with English. And of course, what they reported was not only partial, but late in terms of what a decision maker in Washington needed. So the media isn't everywhere, and the academic press could be very profound, but it's very late, and it doesn't really help you to make decisions quickly. So the need for folks like us, I think, remains kind of inescapable. They might wish to disengage from us, but there is also the fact that you need the execution of diplomacy, which requires diplomats. You have all this glitz of leaders meeting and making agreements, but the agreements they make often simply turn to dust if there is not a great deal of execution and implementation, and how to make them work. Right now we have the Board of Peace, but no peace in Gaza. We have endless discussions, but no negotiation. Endless negotiations, but no solution of many other things. So this is an area that I am particularly keen on, because I think that the academic world is very deficient in not focusing enough on the need for execution to make policies work. And I sometimes use a theoretical example that you could hire tribesmen to secure your roads, and you could find you paid the right people, you helped when they were under attack, and your roads were secured. You could also find they took your money, they took your guns, they used them to fight with their neighbors and build power, and you have had no success in the roads. That's about what we got with that policy of securing pipelines in Iraq. The point is, in one case, you would have a complete success, and the other a failure, and the policy would be the same. That it is the implementation which counts, not the policy decision. And I think there's too little discussion of that in academia. So I think you continue to need us, as much as we may not desire that. So I think that will go on for some time. There is a question which is not exclusively for diplomats, and leaders have used non-diplomatic personnel in many capacities, but there is the question of judgment and of trust. And it's a difficult question because, of course, you have to have the trust not only of people you're dealing with locally, but the trust of your own leaders in order to be listened to. The second is often more difficult. I used to joke that the next hardest thing for an ambassador was to understand the country of his or her assignment, and the hardest thing was to get your capital to care. So that, I think, remains true, but that judgment is disregarded. It isn't always the right judgment, but it needs to be heard. And you only build judgment by a combination of experience and time on the ground with the situation, and getting to know people and understanding what they really think, and why they think it, and whether the reason they're agreeing to something or not agreeing to something is one you can deal with. And sometimes the reasons people give for not dealing with things are not their real reasons. Had a particular case, wonderful anthropologist, Noah Coburn, wrote about a study in Afghanistan once, where engineers come to build or pave a road, and they have a desultory talk with locals. They never get agreement. They keep wanting to go to other routes that aren't suitable. They finally give up and they go away. And for the Westerner, the question is, you dummy, can't you see there's only one road that makes any sense? Well, it takes time, and he finally finds out that the road that makes sense would go through the land of somebody who was on the wrong side in some of the previous fighting. Nobody wants to increase his well-being by paving the road through his land, but they don't want to have a feud or a fight in the village. So well, until you understand that, you can't begin to try to deal with the problem, because it isn't about where the road should be built. And you only get that kind of understanding of problems if you spend a long time learning the people and the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Really means some incredibly important words of wisdom. And I know Bob shares your concern about the big space between policy and implementation. Bob.
Yeah, just absolutely. Just a couple of things that I would add, because I think people have just said, both Menna and Ron have said some very important things that I think everybody can relate to. I've just retired from the diplomatic service, and in preparation for this call, I was thinking, what do I miss? And one of the things that I miss is the network of information flow that I can only get by being a member of the Canadian Foreign Service. And we all talk about, well, so what do you mean? I said, well, if I really want to know what's going on anywhere, I can usually, over a week's time, I can usually get a pretty reliable sense from the professional diplomats who are representing my country in those countries, in those places. And I really miss that. I really miss the obviously the coming over on emails now, but I just miss that depth of knowledge that comes from people who've done exactly what they meant and what Ron talked about, and that is on the ground listening to people. So my first point would be to borrow from a former French cabinet minister and later public administrator and intellectual, Edgar Pisani, who was somebody who came to Canada as an older man, and I got to know him very well. And when he died, we had a colloque in Paris to celebrate his life, and we ended up with three conclusions about what did Edgar really think. What was he all about? And the first one was the importance of listening. And I think we dramatically underestimate the role of diplomacy as an expression of professional listening. And it's not a passive activity. It's actually listening because you're asking questions, listening because you're curious, listening because you want to know, and you know that the person you're talking to knows more than you do. And frequently, certainly in politics, there are two kinds of modes of engagement. One of them is talking, and the other one is waiting to talk. And there's a difference between waiting to talk and listening. Those are two completely different things. And the second thing that Edgar believed strongly in is that you should start every sentence with the premise that you actually could be wrong, that what you think is actually not correct, which imposes a duty of humility on you that in many other professions you very rarely see, because people assume they're right. But a good diplomat knows that, well, you could be right, could be wrong. And so the third one is to create the space in your professional work where there's as much listening and as much humility as you can possibly create. Now that model of interactivity is obviously an ideal that's hard for any of us to reach. But I think it's exceptionally important in understanding that the great diplomats think consequentially. Because the question they're always asking is, okay, you do something, then what happens? And you're trying to get your political leadership to say, I know this makes you feel better, Prime Minister or Minister. I know you want to do this because it may seem like a good idea at the time, or it responds to a domestic political impulse that you need to feed. But you need to think consequentially about what is going to happen when you do that. And I really think that is one of the most important skill sets that a diplomat brings to the conversation. Remembering that the conversations that we have are not only with the countries or the institutions where we're representing, but they're also with our home governments. And one of the most, we haven't really explored this, but one of the key things is to what extent as a diplomat you can tell truth to power that won't necessarily want to hear what you have to say, because our politicians are more preoccupied with the domestic political reaction to what is being contemplated one way or the other. And part of our function as diplomats is to say, well, I know this isn't what you want to hear, Prime Minister, but this is actually what is going on in the world. This is the truth about this, and these are the consequences that will flow from the actions that you're contemplating. And I think that is an incredibly valuable role of an advisor of any kind, whether it's a diplomat or another kind of advisor. But you want calm, you want good judgment. All the things that Menna and Ron have talked about are essential. But the key thing, it seems to me, is just this notion that you think consequentially and you talk consequentially, and you eventually, I think, can have more of an impact on the people around you as a diplomat if you develop a reputation as somebody who's a good listener. Why do we know this? Who maintains their level of curiosity at all times about what's really going on in this country or this society, or in the case of Ron's example, this village, and then taking that to the issue of execution. And I couldn't agree more with what Ron said about execution. Prime Minister Carney has given a very, what I think was a very good speech in Davos. But the reality is, somebody said, "What do you think of the Prime Minister's plan?" And I said, and here I'm going to get into trouble, it's not exactly a plan. It's a description of a problem. And the question of what is the plan is up to us to implement, figure out what does it mean to implement this idea. General Marshall had a plan, but he had a very specific plan as to what he was trying to do with Europe when he gave his great speech at Harvard. And so we need to understand that our job is not to second guess, but our job is to say, okay, now let's figure out how we can actually do what it is that you've set out as your vision. And your vision is great, but nobody's vision is as good as the implementation of that vision. That's the key thing. That's where you have to show your strength. And that's where the question of consequences, the question of how do you do it, I mean, they're not minor technical issues. These are big issues.
Well, thank you, Bob. Yes, the problem of fearless advice, which I think is getting more difficult than even in my time, but it's absolutely necessary. And that is the space between implementation and why there is some delay sometimes because of the consequences. Listen, the conversation's been so rich under the first two questions. The third one now seems rather redundant to me. And I see that on the Q&A line, we've got a number of questions coming up. So if you don't mind, I think I'd like now to go to the audience who's very interested in being able to follow up on so many of the brilliant suggestions, insights that you provided. I thank you very much. You've maintained a degree of optimism about the future, not overwhelmed by the challenges, but nevertheless recognizing them. So maintenant, si vous êtes heureux de prendre vos questions, l'audience, my colleague Olivier is ready to take the questions from the Q&A function. Again, I've asked you to be brief, and I think we're be ready to go in a moment. Olivier, are you coming on now?
I am.
You can ask your questions to the individual panelists or to all three.
Okay. As you said, Alex, we have many questions. So the first one will be to the three panelists. It's a more general, broader one on an issue that maybe we don't talk that much, but which is very significant. And the question is the following. All of our countries seems to be retreating from the concept of soft power by reducing our diplomatic capacity. What will be the impact of reductions in the development assistance programming for Western influence in the short term? Who wants to take this question?
Well, I'll take the easy way out of noting that in the United States, we're not only giving up soft power, we're giving up aid. Um, so packaging that is going to be incredibly difficult. We're not giving it all up. There are areas where this administration, the Trump administration, in fact, does intend to use foreign assistance, but we've been giving up the tools. Uh, I would say that giving up soft power is giving up long range abilities to make friends and persuade people. It's not a short range tool. It doesn't give you very many daily wins in diplomacy, but it is a way to build long range understanding. For the United States, I think this is critical because otherwise people form their impressions of us from movies and from sometimes unfortunate behavior of our leaders. And they do need to understand that that is not the full representation of America. So the consequences of cutting back, I think, are very large. I yield to others.
I'll have a quick go, if I may. I mean, I've always been a big believer as a British diplomat in the power of soft power because I think it's one of Britain's great strengths. You know, I would say we're a soft power superpower in terms of, music, culture, global reach, etc. And I think, I completely agree with what Ronald just said. I mean, it is about longer term attractiveness, I think, and showing the value of living in a democratic society, sort of celebrating what it is to be a free country and the sort of amazing innovation and diversity that grows from that. However, I do think, we're beyond a period perhaps where we thought that soft power was more relevant and would have more oomph and impact in terms of the pressing issues of the day than it's proven to have. I was thinking about this recently, the sort of in the UK, the 90s when Tony Blair came into office and it was all about Core Britannia. And then we went on to host the G8 summit at Gleneagles and it was all about 0.7% of development aid, everyone signing up to that. And it feels that that is really a bit of a bygone era and that we need now to be, I think, much more realistic about the world. As David Lammy used to say, the world as it is, not as we want it to be, and recognise the limits of soft power. And that if soft power means, abandoning our militaries or spending less on defence, then at a certain point it's going to run out of road and we're going to have to, revert to finding harder ways of power in order to defend our legitimate security interests. But of course, I'd like us to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, if that's the right expression. Not abandon soft power. And, I worry deeply, honestly, about the big cuts in development aid, obviously, particularly from the United States. But, in the UK, I think we're down now to 0.3%, because for me, that misses the point, the absolutely critical point that we were talking about earlier about the link between what's happening in far off places and the impact that has on issues that matter very much to people at home. And, not to rehearse the point about the Horn of Africa and migration, but I think that's a great example of sort of short-term interest driving long-term policies in a way that is actually detrimental to the interests of the United Kingdom. So I feel a bit sort of depressed about it. And for all that we still have, Paddington and the English Premier League, some of that looks a bit hollow, frankly, when we look at some of the bigger existential threats that we face in today's world.
Okay.
Just an add-on to say, I think we're all in violent agreement that the three Ds have to go together. And when you undermine one of them, you have a problem. So in Canada's case, I think we paid less attention to security than we needed to, hard security, over quite a long period of time by many different governments of different colors. And I think we're now recognizing that that's not on. It doesn't respond to the nature of the world we're in. But we've got to make sure the pendulum doesn't just swing dramatically over to the other side, where everybody says the only thing that matters is hard power, and that there's no other moral universe in which we operate, which is wrong. I mean, it's actually not just a difference of opinion, but I think it's just factually incorrect to say that that values and looking at underlying economic and social structures globally aren't critically important as well. I spent my last year in New York as the president of the Economic and Social Council, and it really made me think long and hard and realize to what extent the world looks at the situations very differently. Every country has a different perspective depending on its value systems, but also depending on its economic and social conditions. So that if you don't, as a country, as an advanced economy, if you're not aware of all those other factors in how you conduct yourself, you're missing the point. And the other reality is that when we let these things slide, other countries fill the bill. We are in the middle of a major global debate and discussion about how development happens, what is the value of democracy, why not just pick dictatorship? It seems to work much better. Those kinds of arguments, we've got to be prepared for those. And in order to have credibility in responding, our deeds have to match our words, which gets back to Ron Newman's point about execution. If we don't execute and we don't do what we say we believe in, and we don't exercise that by what we do, then our credibility suffers tremendously. And others' power, soft, hard, or whatever, begins to have more impact. And I think that's why we need to continue to encourage our governments to keep up each of the elements that are critical to doing what we need to do, plus greater cooperation among our countries, because we are speaking among countries with a common set of interests, more or less. I could have said that with a greater deal of confidence a little while ago, but I mean, I think we still understand the universe in which we're operating. And I think we need to try to have more impact on governments who neglect any one of the critical elements to what a successful foreign policy is all about.
Thank you. We have many questions related to this theme about the role today of the USA and how the middle powers can react, adapt, adjust to face this new situation. I'll raise the next two ones are more specific. The first one, it's a very geopolitical question. The first one is about the USA. Back in the 1990s, Madeleine Albright described the USA as the indispensable nation. Are we now discovering in the worst possible way that she was right? Who wants to take that one?
Well, let me go ahead.
No. Please go ahead, Bob.
I just think that at the risk of starting a broader debate, I mean, I don't think there's any such thing as. I think the United States was an indispensable nation at the end of the Second World War, because I don't think we would have been able to create the institutions that we created without the leadership of the United States. But having said that, I would also say that we should not neglect the other remarkable leaders in country after country, which provided incredible scope and leadership to the creation of those institutions. It wasn't just the United States that did it. But I think the thing that we're discovering now is that in a world where we can't count on the United States to do or say some of the things that we really, certainly as a Canadian, we really believe in, what that means is that we have to think about what we can do with others to maintain that level of commitment and that level of argument. I mean, I know it upsets Americans when I say this. I believe all countries are exceptional, and I believe that none of us are exceptional. I believe that's true of human beings. I also believe it's true of countries, which takes me back to my fundamental point about humility. Humility is a pretty important human quality that we ignore at our peril. And I think it's something that we all have to try to develop as national habits.
Even countries.
No, go ahead.
No, I said in even countries, humility. It's not just a human.
Yeah. No, that's not one of, it's not everybody's characteristic. but I won't debate indispensable. I mean, indispensable would mean that you fail without that element. So, no, I wouldn't assign that to the United States. But damned important, yes. Um, but I think part of the problem now is it's very difficult for anybody to be quite sure whether the United States is in or out at any given moment. And if we definitely walked away and were isolationist, then one would have to get on without us. Uh, when you're always teetering on this how much, and the US is still so big and so important, it's very difficult to function without us, not to mention being against us. But when you can't tell exactly where we are, when the question of what is US policy has to be answered with the question of, well, did you mean today or tomorrow? Then it's much more difficult for people to adjust. And so you see the fascinating case of what's going on in Europe now, with the case of Ukraine, with this adjustment, slow, not quite fast enough, but of support fiscally and militarily to Ukraine. How far will that go? And I don't know. And it's going to be influenced by what the US does. But it is an interesting example of how the world begins in a very halting way to adjust to a United States which is not isolationist, but it is increasingly self-centered and defines its interests in a much more short range and transactional fashion without any real looking to the consequences of action, which Bob Rae spoke about. By the way, you spoke, Bob, about listening, and I just had to say my former mentor, Hal Saunders, who was very deeply involved in Henry Kissinger's peacemaking with Israel, had a saying which, when he died, they put on a small rock that they gave us, and it said, "Listen deeply enough to be changed by what you hear." And I still keep that on my desk.
Thank you. The next question is more specific, again, very geopolitical. Please comment on the rise of right-wing parties in France and Germany and how that affects EU relations with the UK and Canada. I hear the EU Central Bank President Christine Lagarde may step down early for fear of right-wing dominance in France's next election. So this may be more a question for Dan Menna and for Bob Rae.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? And it's not just France and Germany, by the way. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily equate the Reform Party with the Rassemblement National in France, but there's no doubt similarities in some parts of the platform, and the sort of general rise of right-wing populism across Europe is something that I think we need to be deeply concerned about. In France specifically, which is obviously the country I know best, I think there's at least 50-50 chance that the far right will win at the next presidential elections. Probably more 60-40, to be honest, though of course that's just a stab in the dark, really, because I think the centre has failed to deliver for a vast majority, or is seen to have failed to deliver for a vast majority of French citizens. And as they are in other countries, people are turning to more extreme answers to sort of fundamental problems that actually reflect, an incredibly difficult set of issues arising from the financial crisis, arising from COVID, arising from, sort of problems in the wider world, stagnating productivity, competition from China, et cetera, et cetera. So, I am really worried about it. In terms of implications, I think there are implications for the European Union. I mean, people like Marine Le Pen sort of truly believe that the whole sort of multinational trading sovereignty nature of the EU has gone way, way too far. So they would try to pull it back. How that works with countries like Germany, I think, remains to be seen. I think it's also very dangerous to the sort of transatlantic alliance, to NATO, and given the far right's relationship with Russia in France and elsewhere, certainly in recent history, even not actively at the moment, and there's a lot to worry about in terms of, European coherence, determination, grit and resilience when it comes to Ukraine. So, as I said earlier on, I'm an optimist, but I am really worried about this. And I think it's really important, one of my advice back into our foreign services is that we really need to be spending time now thinking about the possible consequences of far-right governments in countries like France in the next 3 to 5 years. Sorry.
I would, just for the sake of contrast, I agree with what Menna is saying, but I think one has to look at the reality that one thing we know about public opinion is that it changes, and it changes in response to leaders, and it changes in response to social and economic conditions. So I don't think the battle is far from over in any one of a number of countries as to who will win and who will lose in the next elections, whenever when they come in 26 or 27 or 28. It's sort of like predicting what the weather's going to be in 3 years' time. You don't know. So you've got to figure out, the real question is, what do we do about it? And that's where there has to be a very much of a joined up effort among non-populist, non-authoritarian leaning parties to figure out, how do we stop this? And it is not beyond the realm of human imagination to do so. It's just that if people keep doing over and over again what they've been doing, then yes, they will lose, but not necessarily. And where I think this will have the most serious immediate consequences is Ukraine, because the U.S. has pulled back and is playing a role that I feel is actually not constructive at all, and the rest of the coalition of the willing is doing what it can to try to keep up the support for Ukraine. But I think the pressure will become unbearable on Ukraine if we end up with a German or French or British, UK government that is absolutely unsympathetic to the Ukrainian cause. And I don't believe that Russia's disinformation campaigns in all of our countries is stopping or is not happening. It is happening. It's a very real phenomenon that can be traced very clearly back to the bot machine in Russia. So that does trouble me enormously in terms of what is, I think, the most critical security question at the moment. And the broader impact on Europe, I think, will be very real. But part of what I think Prime Minister Carney has been trying to do is to say, okay, how do we pull ourselves together here? And how do we build more broadly, not just in terms of nation to nation, but party to party discussions about how you take on some of the truly dangerous activities of the far right in country after country after country. And I don't think we can, we can't give up, put it simply as that, although that perhaps goes beyond a little bit our diplomatic roles. But now that I've returned to my non-diplomatic status, I'm taking advantage of that by just trying to point out, here are some things that we can do, that we must do globally to respond to what I think are profoundly dangerous trend lines that I see emerging, that we all see emerging in around us. And so we have to figure out how we respond effectively to them.
Oh, thank you. I was to take as a next question one raised by a former local employee at the U.S. Embassy in Alger, but I see, Ambassador Neumann, that you've answered it, and now the question disappeared from my screen. But I was wondering if you could just share what you have answered, because I found it interesting. He was asking if the situation in Algeria in the 1990s would not also deserve the term dystopian. How do you compare what was happening at that point during this civil war or local conflict and what we're seeing today?
Well, it was not, I mean, the normal dystopian description of fiction. It seems to be a world with no order. In Algeria, in the Black Decades, when I was there, the questioner's quite right. I served during an extremely bloody period in Algeria where I think there were something like 1,000 people a month getting killed, and blanket death threat to all foreigners. But it was not a period with a total breakdown of order. It was order being contested, so that you had a government maintaining with a great deal of violence, maintaining itself, which in the end won a military victory. That also was one of the important things that we pretty much all got wrong for a while, in saying you could not have a military victory. Well, you couldn't have it with the kind of tactics and operations that we would find acceptable morally. But not everybody plays by those rules, and in fact, they did win. But you also had a fragmentation within the Islamist insurgency between really nihilistic people and people who have an ideology but who wanted control of a state. And so I wouldn't say that it was a bloody, chaotic world. Probably have various historical analogies, but I'm not sure exactly what we necessarily mean by dystopian. There's a fictional, Mad Max kind of portrayal, and or there's I suppose Central Germany in 30 Years' War, which is dystopian in its own way, but very different with contending organized forces. So it was a very bad, very bloody period, but it did indicate that one could think beyond our common stereotypes. But I don't think that's a very adequate answer, but probably I should leave it there in the interest of time.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. We may have time for one or maybe two more questions. The next one is broader. The Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at Davos has caused not to mourn the collapse of the international liberal rules-based order, relying instead of it on the coalitions of willing middle powers, but without a supranational framework to define tasks, mediate conflicts, build consensus, and knock heads together. Do the panelists think that fear and necessity will enable powers like the UK and Canada to overcome the limitation of jealously protected national sovereignty? And there was a similar question in French about if est-ce que l'attitude du Premier ministre Carney pour contrer l'autoritarisme du président américain est la bonne approche? Is the attitude of the Prime Minister, Canadian Prime Minister, to go against the authoritarian tendencies of the President of the United States, is it the right strategy? So who wants to take that one? Those two.
Je dirais que je pense qu'il est toujours nécessaire de résister aux tendances autoritaires, s'ils viennent dans nos propres pays ou ça vient des États-Unis ou n'importe où. Mais la question la plus importante, c'est d'insister sur l'importance de ne pas abandonner les institutions multilatérales dans le travail qu'ils peuvent faire, mais ça va exiger des réformes nécessaires pour assurer que nous continuerons d'avoir des institutions qui fonctionnent bien et d'une façon efficace. We can't abandon multilateralism, but we have to remember that multilateralism has always taken different forms. The UN is not the only multilateral institution. We mustn't make a mistake of thinking that. We created NATO because the UN couldn't play the role because of the Soviet veto in the Security Council that we needed for our joint security. So I think that it is important to take from what Prime Minister Carney has said is that every country has to remember it has agency in the world, and that agency requires cooperation, and we need to work better together at it in trying to maintain the integrity and the good functioning of institutions that will continue to need our help. And we can't rely on any one single country to do that for us. We have to be prepared to do it ourselves. And I think that's a true statement. Whether it came from my prime minister or somebody else's prime minister, I hope I would still agree with it.
Can I just add one point perhaps, which is just about, and it relates, I think, to what Ron and Bob have said about the difficulty of predicting where all this is going to end. Because, we all lived through the first Trump presidency, and I was really struck by sort of when things returned to a more normal state, or a sort of less radical reforming president in the shape of Joe Biden, how things pretty quickly actually felt like they'd sort of, got back to normal. And I think the big question for Trump too is whether things might also bounce back and just sort of reshape themselves once he's left the presidency, assuming he does at the end of the second term. Or whether, do they bounce back, or are we really in a period of sort of, fundamental strategic change and a huge shift in terms of the US's approach to alliances with its friends as well as its position with its enemies? And I just don't think we know the answer to that yet. And therefore, I think, in a way, the only thing we can all do is sort of hedge. I mean, there needs to be a lot of hedging, I think, in terms of relationships that we hold. And I think you can really see that with the UK, the huge efforts to stay in the room with the US president, the influence that I think we are exercising behind the scenes, and, huge credit, I mean, obviously to the Prime Minister, but also to Jonathan Powell, I think, who has done a brilliant job of building strong relationships with other national security advisors, both sides of the Atlantic. I think that is critical at the moment to keep those channels open. But at the same time, I think it has been a wake-up call for the UK, who more than any other country, arguably, have seen the US as our indispensable partner and lent perhaps more heavily than many others. France, of course, would say, it always saw the writing on the wall. It's always retained a greater degree of European sovereignty around its own nuclear deterrence, etc., etc. But I think, we have leaned very hard that way. And for me, a good hedging strategy is what the government are trying to do at the moment, which is build stronger, lasting relationships with the European Union, even though we decided a few years ago to leave. And I think that has to be the way it is. And it's a bit messy. It's not very clear in terms of, strategic direction. But given that we don't know from one day to the other what sort of US we're going to wake up with, I think, hedging has got a lot of merit at the moment.
I think that Menna has got this exactly right. Now, I think there will be bounce, but it's like when you drop a ball on the ground, each bounce has less elevation. So you had a bounce in Biden, although you also had a statement that we're back and we're going to consult, which we did about Afghanistan, and then we proceeded to absolutely ignore everything that our friends and allies said to us in the consultation. So how much we were back was a little bit questionable. And now, of course, we have this, but I think you will be exactly where Dave Menna described. Countries will not be able to be sure from one day to another. Even if the policies seem to return to previous policies, they will be accepted with a mental hesitation and a question of how dependable they will be over how long a period. And so that will leave you exactly, I think, leave many countries exactly where Dave Menna described them, that seeking cooperation, attempting influence, not writing the U.S. off, and yet always with a sort of a finger up in the breeze to see what may change, and a notion of how do you have some insurance policy. And that is going to be a somewhat chaotic world. Of course, it's a world of, several hundred years of experience of nation states. Not quite what we thought we'd have, but I think it is the world we're going to be dealing with.
Well, with that, I'm going to have to bring this to a close, but I'm left with an incredible message, very sobering, and a visual. Thank you, Ron. You have a way of that ball bouncing and us wanting to grab it and bounce it harder. I want to thank Olivier for managing the numerous and very insightful questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't get through anywhere near all of them. I want to acknowledge two members of AM Canada who made this event happen, Doug George, who's been managing our Zoom platform, and Karen Reinecke, an incredibly efficient office manager. But most of all, to this amazing panel, what a richness. Dame Menna, Ambassador Neumann, and Bob Rae, you're so candid and thoughtful in sharing the views and advice. I take heart, I think, in your underlying message that we've survived earlier periods that were challenging. The history books will say whether this was more challenging, and that what mattered then is now is the ability of diplomats to adapt faster than the chaos. And most importantly, as all of you spoke so eloquently, to not lose those core values and skills, listening deeply, advising wisely, exercising agency, employing a full toolbox of hard and soft diplomacy, and most importantly, rebuilding that cooperation, case by case and coalition by coalition. We are recording this event. I want you, all the organizations that are gathered here today, to really share it. There's such a richness. And I encourage each of you online today to take the opportunity to remind and to teach and to mentor the new generation of diplomats. They have our future in their hands. Au revoir. See you next year when our host will be actually the United States, and d'accord. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Well, thank
Merci
you. My
à tous.
only
Merci,
regret here is
Alex.
that I can't adjourn to a drink with all of you.
Protocol and
That would be
alcohol.
nice.
I'll remember that one too,
Alcohol.
Menna.
And don't forget the Geritol.
Doug, are we good?